Hello, and welcome everyone to the 13th webinar in Contact's Produce Safety webinar series. This second season continues to tackle fresh produce safety topics every month through a dynamic webinar series that will continue to bring together industry, academia, and regulatory minds to solve some of the produce industry's biggest and most timely challenges. This series is part of a larger industry outreach and risk mitigation project called CONTACT, or Scientific Challenges and Cost-Effective Management of Risks Associated with Implementation of Produce Safety Regulations. This project is supported by the Specialty Crops Research Initiative from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This webinar series, coupled with other research and extension efforts, is part of a collaborative effort across 10 different universities and government institutions to enhance produce safety knowledge and compliance across the industry. We are so grateful to our collaborators for their efforts and support of this webinar series. Their logos can be seen on the screen. This webinar series will continue next month with an expert food economist, Dr. Rob Scharf, discussing some of the recent causes of foodborne illnesses on Thursday, March 16th, 2023. It must have been the chicken. Attribution of illness burdens to specific foods. I hope you will take the journey with me to dive into a topic that will be really interesting. Rob is a fantastic economist and excels in translating the world of foodborne illness attribution, which is really fascinating. Please join us. This year's webinar series will address brand new topics chosen by you. Also, for those of you that fill out the evaluations, I hear you, root cause analysis will be coming in season 3. We've still got an exciting list of webinars scheduled for this year, covering topics like sanitation case studies and the California Ag Neighbors Program. If you think a topic is missing from the list, let us know in the comments, webinar surveys, or on our social media pages. Email me. We want this to be something that you enjoy. While the webinar series lets us meet with you once a month, you know what I'm going to say. That's just not enough for us. We'd love to hashtag make contact with you about today's webinar or other produce safety news and research on our Twitter and Instagram pages. Follow us on these platforms at PS_SCI. Be sure to check out the Contact website and YouTube page for more produce safety resources, including our key takeaway documents, webinar recordings, and so much more. Subscribe to our page and get instant notifications of content like our soon-to-drop mini webinars. A quick reminder for today, if you would like to submit a question for our speakers before or during the Q&A session, please submit your questions through the Q&A box and not the chat box. Now, let's welcome the leader of this fantastic panel. Dr. Jennifer McEntire leads the food safety team at the International Fresh Produce Association, with previous leadership roles at GMA, the Atchison Group, and IFT, where she led the FSMA Traceability pilots. She is active in the Global Food Traceability Center for Produce Safety and received the 2020 NSF International Food Safety Leadership Award. Welcome, Jennifer. The floor is yours to kick us off and introduce us to your fabulous co-pilots.
Hi, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's quite a group that we have here today, and so I'm excited to talk about a topic that I have been talking about for about 15 years now. I'm joined by two amazing gentlemen, Drew McDonald from Taylor Farms and Tejas Bhatt with Walmart. I guess going back in time, Tejas and I was very fortunate to bring Tejas on as an intern back at IFT, and he was a fantastic asset because he had a background in both computer science and food science. And so when we're talking about the topic of traceability, it was just a perfect fit to launch right into the IFT pilots. Drew, I actually met around that time. And the very first time that I met Drew, whether he remembers it or not, was when I was doing some kind of learning about different parts of the food system and how traceability was managed within not just produce, but other parts of the food system. And Drew was kind enough to give me a tour of one of their processing facilities. Now, fast forward several years when I joined the International Fresh Produce Association, then at the United Fresh side, got to work with Drew as the chair of the Food Safety Council. Drew was very involved in CPS, and he and I authored an article on traceability, which I'll reference here in just a little while. This is going to be pretty conversational. We're going to talk about traceability to the buyer and beyond. We will, toward the end of the conversation, talk about the rule, which I'm sure many people are very interested in. But before we do that, we'll pull up some polls. We want to have a sense of who you are. So are you in the produce kind of sector, any stakeholder within the produce side? Are you here representing some part of the food system, but not the produce part? Maybe you do produce and other foods, or you're somebody else. And then the second question will be the who are you, where are you in the supply chain? Because I think that will help us tailor our comments a little bit. Most people do seem to be from the produce side of things, but a handful who are outside of produce, and then a bunch of you, almost a quarter so far, that do all foods, and then a couple people who don't do food. So Laura, let's go ahead and end this poll and share the results with everybody so they can just see who's on the line. Again, over 60% somewhere within the produce sector, about a quarter all food. So we'll tailor our comments. I think today it'll be a little bit of a produce-centric discussion, given that this is the contact webinar. But let's go ahead, Laura, if you can, and launch the second question. And where in the supply chain, what type of stakeholder are you? So on the supplier side, the grower processor, on the buyer side, distributor and beyond, if you come from the regulatory, whether that's federal, state, local, anywhere in academia, whether you're a technology provider or you're some other part of the system. All right, wow, like a third of the people on the grower processor side, over a quarter from the regulatory side, good representation from the buyer side also, as well as academia, a handful of technology providers. Let's dig in a little bit into our content here. So I wanted to start by, just because we will talk about the traceability rule, just the basics of how a law becomes a regulation. So we had FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, that was written by Congress, signed into law by President Obama, but it was written by Congress, and it directed FDA to do many things. So we've seen several rules come out, including the traceability rule. In many parts of FSMA, and I would say for the traceability for that section, what we call Section 204, Congress was kind of specific. So yeah, FDA has some flexibility when they're writing a rule, but they have to do what Congress said. So there may be some things about the rule that you don't like that aren't necessarily FDA's fault. They had to follow what Congress is saying. FDA tries to do what they think Congress intended, use the authority that they've been granted, and put out a proposed rule. So we saw that proposed rule a couple of years ago and had the opportunity for public comment, something that we as the association took advantage of. Individual companies, anyone can offer a public comment on what they think and how they think this proposed rule should be changed before it's finalized. Every once in a while, and we saw this with the preventive controls rule, the produce safety rule, FDA will do a little bit of a rewrite and come out with a supplement. Some groups had asked that for the traceability topic that be done before FDA finalized the rule, but FDA was up against a pretty strict timeline to get the final rule out. So it really wasn't possible to add that extra step in that you see on the right-hand side. FDA does need to consider all the public comment, and you'll see as you're reading the rule, the first probably 500 plus pages are just background and explanation, and then they go point by point of all the public comments and how they considered them, whether it influenced what was in the final rule or if FDA disagreed. In the absence of having a guidance document, which I don't anticipate we'll have for a while, that preamble part, that explanation of their thinking is probably the best thing to refer to above and beyond the strict requirements that are there in the codified rule. So you'll see that the link to the rule itself is there at the bottom, but the real rule, like the codified rule, after all that explanation, it's at the very end. It's at the very end, those last 30 pages or so of the document. So what is traceability? Laura, if we can launch this poll, and I think that Drew, Tejas, and I'll have a good discussion once we see what you all think traceability is and what the most important benefit for traceability is. To me, it's fundamental to how you approach traceability as a company. So 84% of you are coming at this from a food safety standpoint. But there are a couple of you who realize that there may be other things we can do with traceability, consumer trust, the authenticating some claims, whether it's organic, whatever. Here, 2 votes, 2 out of the 258 of you, 1% have shrink reduction. A couple of you have others. Drew, I'll ask you what you make of this, and then Tejas, I'll ask you what you make of the poll results, and feel free to elaborate in the context of just how have you heard people talk about traceability and why it's desirable and what it means. Drew, go ahead.
Interesting. I'm surprised by the results from the audience. I would say, what do we mean by food safety? To me, we could also have not that we want more polls, but another poll that would break down what about food safety. And I think that's where you really see differences of opinion. I think what I've experienced with the whole topic of traceability under the food safety umbrella is everyone has a different sense of what traceability means. So is it one bag or one head of lettuce or one packed product and you know exactly what farm it came from? Is it how you get to the answer on an epidemiological traceback? Is it the answer to solving an outbreak? And I would always argue that no, it's not. Many of us will say we have traceability right now. It's a tool and a potentially part of the process, but it's not the answer. It's not, oh, you have traceability, now you've solved food safety. It's a tool in the process, whatever the question is, whether it's an outbreak or a foreign material traceback or whatever it is, it's a tool to get to an answer.
Tejas, having worked in this space and through several different kind of positions, what conversations have you heard around what is traceability? Why is it important?
Jennifer, it's interesting. If you had asked me to take this poll 5 years ago, I would have probably selected food safety myself. But what's interesting is over the last few years, through the journey that we've been at Walmart, the whole focus on supply chain traceability and transparency has shifted towards more around supply chain resiliency, especially with all these supply chain disruptions that we had because of the pandemic. And so today, Walmart Food Traceability Journey, as we call it, is being led by our business teams. They can see value in better freshness management, better shelf life management, et cetera. And then, by the way, food safety and transparency is a side benefit of that. And in many cases, it actually makes it easier to make the ROI and the business case within your own companies. If it is not a compliance-driven initiative, you'll get more buy-in, you'll get more momentum in making that change. I think all of these are the value adds of traceability to some degree or another. And depending on where you're in the supply chain and what your goals are, one might weigh heavily than the other. And so I completely agree with Drew. It's the definition of how granular you want to go with traceability will really depend and vary. But overall, the benefits, I think, are across the board.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points that you both made. I predicted that food safety would rank high here. And I think the rule itself is that FDA is focused on the food safety aspects of traceability, although Tejas, that return on investment is probably not going to be found on the food safety side of things. But let's talk a little bit about the outbreak investigation process, and I will speculate as to what I think FDA is trying to achieve by having better traceability within the industry. Bear in mind that outbreaks and recalls are not the same. When there's an outbreak, it all starts with the person, a person who ate something, or before this time, we don't even know if it's something they ate. Maybe they swam in a lake or something and they get sick. They get sick enough that they seek medical attention. and that practitioner says, hey, we're going to collect a stool sample or something like that and do some analysis to determine that, oh, yes, this person has this particular illness. How do we know that it's not just that one person, that it is part of a bigger story, that it is an outbreak? If an isolate is collected, it's available. It is generally subject to whole genome sequencing. That's easier done for some types of organisms than for others. But it has been, I think it's been a game changer over the past several years in detecting and recognizing that there are outbreaks. So Listeria is probably the best example where there aren't that many cases. And when you have one case in one state 1 year and another case in a different state many months or years later, it may not, why would you think that they're related? But whole genome sequencing lets us see that genetically they're very similar or identical. Maybe there's something going on here. So we now see outbreaks happening that probably were happening before, but just flying under the radar. And so have that detection, that recognition that there is an outbreak. How do you know that it's food? It's by talking to consumers and trying to figure out, talking to the ill people, figure out what do they have in common. So there are standardized questionnaires that usually it's the state or local public health officials will go out and ask people. And it's a very time-consuming process. Like when you're sick, do you really want to sit through and answer all these questions about what did you eat for the past couple of weeks? And at this point, it may be weeks ago. So not easy to try to put all these data together and see if there's something unusual, something that pops, a food item perhaps that is showing up within that population of ill people more than you would expect based on normal consumption patterns. So there's kind of some statistics involved in that to try to think about what food do we think is causing illness. But then we get to the point of, okay, we think we know the category of food, but what's the brand? Where did it come from? Was there a common processor? Was there a common grower? At this point, we're transitioning from I'll say the CDC side of things, trying to work with ill people and identify the type of food, and transitioning over to the FDA side of things, where they're going to those stores. They are asking the stores, the restaurants, where did you get this product from? Can you show me the records? And then tracing it back through the supply chain. So this is where in this outbreak investigation process, traceability starts. So many steps beforehand. There is a way to jump ahead by doing testing. If you find the isolate in a product, then that's okay. Now we know that it is in that product. But many times, especially for produce, we don't have that opportunity. And so it is the reliance on records to try to narrow it down to that common source, that point of convergence. So really what we're trying to solve here is starting on that side, the left-hand side of the diagram, that point of sale, point of service, where people ate, where people shopped, following what can be very complex supply chains and getting over to ideally that one point that everything has in common. And for many reasons, it's really difficult to do. Drew, Tejas, anything you want to comment on before I move on to the next slide?
I think, yeah, these are great visuals of it. I'll say my comments just on when we get to talking of the complexity of it is at the heart of it, especially when we're dealing with produce, especially when you're dealing with something that's commingled, and commingled's not a bad thing. A salad is a commingled product. And so that's just part of the complexity. I think it's important to point out.
Yeah.
The other thing I would point out that this diagram doesn't represent or cannot represent is the velocity of movement of product, especially for short shelf life product like fresh produce. These things go through the supply chain so quickly that it becomes increasingly harder to identify weeks later, as you said, Jennifer.
That's a great point. And we want people to be eating a lot of fresh produce. And we see that many consumers, fortunately, do eat. Maybe they have a salad every single day. So then if you start asking people, what did you eat in the last week? And that they have many salad exposures, well, which one might it have been? It becomes volume, frequency, and the statistics become very messy. Drew.
It's important to point out, going to your other slide, the outbreak steps, 1, 2, 3, 4. When you get to this step, I think one of the challenges is it's almost as if a conclusion has been made about the food source. And, what I always encourage is really trying to see an iterative process where if you go down a path and it doesn't match a distribution pattern like this, then do you go back and re-examine? And I think sometimes that needs to be more deliberate, that it allows for an iterative back and forth as new information comes in.
Yeah, the diagram that I have up here shows that there was a grower in common. What if you go to those 4 points of sale, points of service, and they go in 4 completely different directions? Then I think you do need to ask yourself, are we tracing the right thing here? Tejas, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I just want to react to what Drew said. It's a really good point. And my hope is that as this Section 204 gets implemented and we get more standardized, more electronic traceability implemented across the board for all the foods that are on the FTL, if it is easier to query that data, then we can expect a more iterative process. I think the reason it's not iterative today is because it's so manual and it's so difficult to do it iteratively in a timely manner. But I hope that we get to a point where it can become iterative because the data is readily available to be analyzed.
One other small point, I think I just want to point out the word common here is also, I think, something that has to be explored better because, and you have Tejas on from Walmart and I'm here with Taylor Farms. We're both large companies. And so often it's not uncommon that we would be a commonly identified source of purchase or as a provider. And that to me is sometimes problematic because it's a tyranny of averages. And I think Tejas is right that as the traceability data comes in faster, then you have this ability to not just say, oh, wow, look, I see these 2 buyers or 2 points of purchase or whatever coming up commonly. And in many cases, it's the one that isn't common that might be the important clue. So if 3 out of 4 report Walmart or Taylor Farms, that 4th one that absolutely did not is important, but you can't dismiss that. So I think that process going back and forth again is going to be very important.
No, agreed. So the visual that I have up here comes from the IFT traceability pilot report. This was done back right after it required FDA to conduct these traceability pilots. Tejas and I had the tremendous opportunity to work on them, and we were under the gun to get those pilot reports in quickly. So we were done. I think this was out in 2012. So it is more than a decade old, but I think that the information on the slide is still fairly accurate, that we see the different directions. So a trace back and recall in the other direction, where the information at the grower, the processor, they're the ones making the product, assigning lot numbers, they have the data, but as that product flows from the left to the right side, out through distribution to retail and food service, it gets lost along the way, ultimately to consumers. And how many consumers are writing down the lot numbers of the products that they're eating? It's just the information kind of the flow of the information and the flow of the investigation are in opposite directions. And so I think the goal is also to have better information throughout the whole supply chain. Drew mentioned some of the kind of challenges associated with fresh produce. This is from the article that he and I had put together, doing a compare and contrast between fresh produce and shelf-stable products. So shelf-stable may be around for longer, or at least they can be around for longer. You think about some of the flour associated outbreaks, peanut butter associated outbreaks, where the investigators could go into people's homes and they could take that product, they could test it. They knew the lot number because they had the actual container right there. So really very different approach. And we're often pretty limited on the produce side of things, given the timing of when people get sick, when the outbreak is recognized. Produce probably is not available anymore. Every once in a while, yes, but compared to processed foods, no, very different. And we are at risk then of having some broad advisories issued if the investigation, that reliance on records, can't get back to a source quickly enough. Anything anybody want to comment on this one?
Important to point out, you said it's happened. It feels FDA and the states are trying to get out in front, realizing that you can't wait 2 weeks to start going out and testing. So it feels like the testing is happening sooner. And I think that's a good thing, because we have seen several examples now that it's still in a consumer's refrigerator or even on a shelf. And so I think that deserves recognition, that it does appear they're recognizing you got to get out there early on, and it seems to be happening.
Jennifer, just one more thing on this. Not just the outbreaks are different between fresh produce and shelf stable, but in many cases, the supply chains are different. The flow of product is different. It might be a different distribution center that shelf stable products go through compared to fresh produce. And so the impact of this regulation is pretty large, given that it includes nut butters. It impacts a much broader swath of the industry than it would if it was just fresh produce.
No, that is true. We'll talk in a minute about the food traceability list and show the produce and non-produce items that are on the food traceability list. We talked about outbreaks, and to me, that is the more challenging situation. Generally speaking, when I talk about traceability to companies, their mind usually goes to recalls. We know how to do recalls. We do recalls all the time. Grocery stores are just going to clear the shelf anyway. And I think it's critically important to recognize the difference between outbreaks and recalls. Recall, a company, quote unquote, voluntarily issues the recall. They know what food they're recalling. They know whether it's lot numbers, production dates. They have a scope of that recall that they can communicate through the supply chain. And as the supply chain seeks to remove product from distribution, they want to be conservative. They don't want to leave any chance that a little bit of that product might have made its way through. And so usually, they are going to apply some buffers and clear the shelves. But a traceback is quite different, as we've described. It is not led by the industry. It is led by FDA. And the food is not known. The goal is to identify what is the food with as high degree of granularity as possible. And so then having those buffers, it could be A, it could be B, it could be C, really make it much more difficult to get that fine tuning back to the source of the problem, that point of convergence. So you get a whole lot of noise and start to lose the signal when you have so many buffers, and they multiply as you go from the grocery store, and you have multiple points of service where that traceback is beginning, and then they multiply through distribution, they multiply to a processor perhaps. And so it becomes an awful lot of tails that need to be chased. Any comment? Tejas?
Just out of curiosity, I would love to get Drew and your thoughts. If we had a third column for advisory, would it be any different?
So if we had advisory, what would you say, Drew?
I think I understand in some cases why the advisory comes out. I don't know what would change in the list. I think it's an interesting question, Tejas. I don't know how productive the advisories are. I understand why they're done, but I just don't know if they achieve. I think the core investigation table in some ways can help serve as a pre-advisory almost. Hey, this is going on, but I don't know how I would change the table around advisory. I would keep it off of it.
I have an idea of how I should change this table. I need some arrows. So I need to go from traceback and draw one arrow that goes to recall, because ideally you would have a traceback, you would find the source, then that firm could recall the product. But the second arrow off of traceback, if the noise is just too great and the traceback doesn't identify a single source that can then recall a concrete descriptive product, then that other option is advisory. So I think I need to redo this graphic, because in an outbreak, a traceback would lead to recall, or if it doesn't, to an advisory. That's my thinking. So the problems that the regulators are trying to solve, on the recall side, for sure, always room for improvement, but the traceback is a bit more problematic, generally speaking. So I will note, we have record keeping requirements on the books today. There is a 1 up, 1 down, 1 forward, 1 back record keeping requirement. So why was there the need for this rule? A little bit of background on that. It comes from the Bioterrorism Act. So when we talked at the early part of the presentation about the authorities that FDA has, this was an authority that was granted under the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. The rule was finalized nearly 20 years ago, went into effect a couple of years later. The information at first glance seems, good. The immediate previous source, the immediate subsequent recipient, the name, telephone number, but it's these asterisks, these kind of if available, that provide some loopholes where the dots just have not been connecting the way that gets FDA back to that point of convergence quickly enough. I will note that farms and restaurants were also specifically excluded from these requirements. So that end point of the supply chain where the investigation starts, and then that other end of the supply chain that is producing the product, those were excluded. So now we're up to the rule itself. So this is referred to as Section 204. It required FDA to designate what the Act calls high-risk foods. FDA, I think, appropriately recognized, like many of these foods, like most fresh produce items, they're incredibly healthy, and we don't want to scare people away by calling them high risk. This is one of the areas where Congress was very specific about how FDA should go about determining the types of foods that would be on the list. In a nutshell, it's those that have been associated with outbreaks and recalls, but Congress was pretty prescriptive here. The rule requires FDA to establish record-keeping requirements in addition to more specific than what is existing in the one up, one down today. So the one up, one down is not going away. That applies pretty much to everybody, all registered facilities, at least for all types of food products. This new rule here applies to only a subset of foods, broader part of the supply chain. So it is inclusive end to end. And in terms of timing, can you even believe it's 9 years ago that FDA put out this kind of structure, how they were thinking about doing the math, basically, to determine which foods would qualify as these high risk, now food traceability list foods. So there was the opportunity for public comment, and many groups commented on how FDA was thinking about using Congress's direction. But then FDA didn't come out with the proposed traceability rule. And finally, some consumer groups took FDA to task on this, and as part of a consent decree, FDA committed to certain timeframes, and that included this final rule deadline of November 2022. FDA did meet the deadline. It took a little while for a rule of this size to actually publish, so it was a little bit later in November, but that's when we all got to see it. One of the things that I think is overlooked, and that I do think is important if you're a policy wonk like me, is that we call it 204. A lot of people refer to this rule as 204, but FDA leveraged more than the authority of FSMA. So FDA has authority from many different acts of Congress. They did leverage some of the broader authorities that are granted to them through the U.S. Public Health Service Act. So it's FSMA 204 plus the U.S. Public Health Service Act. The nuts and bolts are that at critical tracking events, those points in the supply chain, those transformations that occur, they need to capture key data elements and link to the traceability lot codes. So those critical tracking events are harvesting, cooling, packing, any transformation, which would include repacking, receiving, and shipping. Tejas, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about the background of these terms, critical tracking events and key data elements, which now they're codified in a rule here. They are used ubiquitously, but they did not always exist, these terms. You want to share where they came from?
Yeah, they came out from Institute of Food Technologists publications, and it was 2008, 2009, something like that, when it originally was coined. And I'm so glad that it's become common terminology, because that's where it all starts. You need to all say the same things and mean the same things when we say it. So I think it's a great thing that they've adopted both critical tracking events and key data elements that came out of IFT.
Yeah, a little compare and contrast between the one up, one down that's already on the books and this rule. Again, the foods themselves differ. So the new rule being much narrower, applying only to certain foods, but the breadth of the supply chain being broader. So the traceability rule does include the grower, harvester, out to the retail store and restaurant establishment. The rule also requires a traceability plan. It requires those links to be made, whereas I would argue that the one up, one down is pretty weak in that regard. And it has many specific key data elements at each of those critical tracking events, more than just the where did you get it from, who did you send it to, the lot number, if available. The one up, one down always required that this information be provided to FDA within 24 hours. That's pretty much the same in the new rule as well, recognizing that if FDA asks for a whole lot of data, you may be able to work with the agency a little bit. But FDA wants these data in an electronic sortable spreadsheet. So that is a new requirement that we're seeing within this rule. Laura, if we can go to our next poll question, I'm curious to see who has read the final traceability rule. About half of you have read at least some of it. When you add in the people who say, yes, I have read the rule, we're at that about 60-ish% mark. About 38% haven't yet. But again, if you haven't, or if you just read some, make sure you get to the back, start at the back, and then read all the explanation and stuff. All right, we have our next question, our second part of the question. If you either read or were following what the proposed rule was, which came out just about a couple of years ago, and you have a decent familiarity with the final rule, and you've done a little bit of a compare and contrast, are you happier with this final rule? Do you think that it's an improvement compared to what FDA had originally proposed? And I will ask Drew and Tejas to, if they're comfortable, for their opinions here as well. Solidly 2/3 of you aren't quite sure. Of those who have an opinion, substantially more people say, yes, the final rule is better, but there are a handful of you who think, no, what was proposed was better. Drew, why don't you give your opinion? Do you think that the final rule is better than what was proposed?
There's just some language, first receiver versus first packer, that was improvement. In some of the examples in the proposed rule, it was very confusing. They basically simplified it. And I think starting out, that's probably a better thing. It was less prescriptive, I think, as they looked at some of the studies they had done and reviews and the feedback. I think it really paid off. All the comments coming in, I feel like they really listened. So I think, yeah, it's better than the proposed.
Tejas, do you have an opinion?
I think there are parts that are definitely better and parts that are still very challenging to implement. And so I think at the end of the day, the implementation is really what's going to tell us if this rule is better or not.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And so I did try to do this is an incomplete, so I left some blank lines at the bottom, kind of comparison between what was in the proposed rule. Drew mentioned the first receiver, which was very difficult to figure out how you would actually implement that concept. It's been replaced by this first hacker, which is a bit clearer. Still some questions in my mind, but better. The proposed rule would have required companies to maintain a list of the foods that they handled on the food traceability list, which if you thought through how that would work also could be very complicated. So now there's the traceability plan, so that there's not that requirement to maintain a list. The data elements that FDA called key data elements in the United Fresh, and I think the PMA comments, we pushed back that many of the data elements FDA proposed to require really weren't key. They were data, but it was just a lot more stuff. So they have simplified and scaled back to what arguably would be better viewed as the key data elements. And there are a few more kind of nuances, caveats, allowances in the final rule, and they are reflective of the public comments. And so I would encourage anytime, whether it's a rule or a guidance document that's out in a proposed or draft form, that people take advantage, that they read it, that they think about how it would apply to them, and they give that feedback to the agency, because it definitely does matter. Here are the foods that are on the food traceability list. So you can see that many of them are in the produce category, but not all. And FDA will be updating the list about every 5 years. That also was in response to public comments. At least United Fresh had asked, when are you going to refresh this list? Because things change. And hopefully some of the industries that have, and some of the food products that have experienced outbreaks, recalls, use those learnings to improve their systems. And then there should be a mechanism for them to come off the list. So that will be, expect a refresh every once in a while. And In addition, it's not just these foods themselves that are on the list, but also foods that contain these foods as ingredients, especially if there's not processing a thermal kill step. So this kind of begs the question, knowing that this list is large and it includes the ingredients, and knowing that the list may change, do we expect, and we can pull up the next poll question, do we expect that companies, especially on the receiving side, that they'll maintain different systems for foods that are on the food traceability list versus foods that are not on the traceability list? So we do have 42% who say maybe some companies will keep two different systems, some won't. A number of you not sure, and then some say yes, some say no. From what we've heard, it would be difficult for many companies to manage two different receiving systems, two different shipping systems, that the expectation would be, particularly maybe for larger firms, that there would just be one system. And then it maybe makes this food traceability list a little bit of a moot point if buyers are going to, in that expectation, if they're just having one system. Drew, you want to comment on that?
You said, you think the larger the company and the more, especially the more complex ingredients they're handling, they're most likely not going to have different systems. Now, within the same system, what I see happening is that, for example, we would not necessarily capture all the same information for every single ingredient, but just for those that require it. So I think that's what we're going to see. Now, the other possibility, and I'd put this to Tejas, is you might get customers that will say, I want this for everything, no matter if it's on the FTL or not.
I think it's a good point, Joy. That's exactly what I was going to say. Essentially, it's going to be most likely going to be one system, but the data that we would require for certain products might be different compared to the data that we might require for others. And a lot of this rule is around data. And so our compliance checks against the data would also probably be focused on foods that are on the FTL to start with. From a process point of view, not systems, but a process point of view, I think is more where Drew was going. We don't want two different processes to receive products in our distribution centers and, send them to our stores and clubs. And so we have to figure a way out to have one process to receive both types of products on and off the FTL list. And I'll be completely honest, we haven't figured out how we're going to do all of that yet. We're actively working on figuring out how we're going to comply with that.
All right.
Did see a question in the chat where I think another version of this question just adds is if you're a co-manufacturer, or in the case of produce, we have cross-docking many times. I think those kinds of elements are going to be more difficult. When we see it already with questions from FDA sometimes in terms of kind of ownership of the product versus who is the first packer. And so that, I think, is where we're going to see some difficulties, or challenges that people are going to have to address.
Yeah, devil's in the details. The traceability plan is, to me, I think, fairly straightforward. What are the procedures you use to maintain these records? How do you identify foods on the food traceability list? How do you assign those lot codes? And who's a point of contact? So in the event that FDA needs more information, who do they actually go to? For growers, there is a requirement to have the farm map, including the geographic coordinates or whatever other information is needed to identify the location. Where did that product actually come from? There are many exemptions. Read the rule, many exemptions, but I'll highlight a couple because I know some of the questions that came in with the registration specifically related to the produce safety rule. And bottom line, if you are exempt from the produce safety rule, if you're not covered, then that exemption does carry over here. Additionally, there are exemptions, a specific exemption within this rule for produce farms that have that under $25,000 a year in sales, as well as for small retail and restaurants that at the location level bring in less than $250,000 in food sales each year. So there are many, many exemptions. The compliance date's January 2026 for everyone. So doesn't depend what your point in the supply chain is, doesn't depend what your business size. If you are covered by the rule, it is January 2026. But obviously, from an enforcement standpoint, I think that FDA will recognize that not everybody can be like in perfect compliance on that date. So we're not really sure what compliance is, what that enforcement strategy is going to look like. Let's launch this next poll about third-party audit requirements, because I have often found that they drive a lot of behaviors and they're out there enforcing, if you will, much more frequently than FDA may be on your farm or in your facility. Where do we see this rule, its requirements compare to the third-party audit requirements? Are they similar? Is the rule have more stringent requirements? Do audits have stronger requirements? Or is there some uncertainty around that? Drew, as you're seeing the results coming in, do you want to comment on the audit world? Because you surely are subject to many audits.
It's interesting. I think this one will reflect where people are in the supply chain, because I think at the front end where we are, it's about the same, right? We're not really changing a lot. We have to do it. The rule has more details, but I would expect that the audit are going to catch up to those. But I think as you move along the supply chain away from us, I think it'll definitely feel that the rule is harder and stricter and stronger.
No, I was going to say exactly that, Drew, that at the end of the day, I don't think this question matters, because the third-party auditors would change their program to meet what the rule is expecting anyways. But I completely agree with you that different parts of the supply chain will find different complexities.
So again, a very mixed decision here on this question. So let's go to the next poll question. Will the rule change how industry leverages technology? So we talked a little bit about systems. We talked a little bit about processes. Tejas, if you had a crystal ball and you're looking into the future, the industry, the entirety of the industry, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is there greater adoption of technology if you had to predict?
The only thing my crystal ball tells me is that I'm going to continue being bald. That's the only thing it tells me. I don't know anything else about the future. I think the reality is that, especially at someone like Walmart scale and the diversity of suppliers and supply chains that we have, it's going to have a diversity of technology system solutions that cater to different parts of that supply chain. So overall, I think it is going to increase the number of entities in the supply chain that adopt more electronic, more readily available traceability data. And eventually, once we have better compliance against this regulation, I am cautiously optimistic that it's going to help drive progress.
Most people, 2/3 of the people, agree that industry will leverage technology and that it will result in progress. But there's nearly 1/3 who say, yeah, but that comes at a cost and could put people out of business. Drew, do you have a perspective on this?
I do. Strong perspective. There's one common email I get every day is from various vendors, and it's all about traceability, right? We're going to solve your traceability issues. And it really has created a cottage industry. And I've heard conversations or references that there's a lot of low cost, no cost solutions and all these things. And I'm actually a little surprised at the low percentage of vendors, technology vendors on the call. I think it's not an either, or not that this is an either or. I think it's a loaded question. I think the first answer I would say is anytime you add a change, it's going to increase your cost. On our end, on the front end of this, we already have existing technology. If you start layering on other components, that potentially increases work and more inputs, et cetera, that's going to be a cost. But I think it will result in progress at the same time. I think companies that have not been using technology for this, obviously it's going to add cost. And I think there's going to be steps forward and steps backwards because they might implement the wrong technology or they might not be aware of it. So I just always caution people, it's just a tool. Make sure, especially the technology companies, understand what problem they're trying to solve for that specific operation. And what works for one company may not work for another. And you really have to understand what the process is, because it is complex when you look at all the different scenarios between growers and harvesters and packing steps and processing steps, et cetera, all the way down the distribution chain.
Jen, if I can say one more thing before we move on. Cost in terms of dollars is one thing, but we also need to consider the cost of time. If we have to start scanning every case as it moves through the supply down to distribution and retail, it's going to slow down the velocity that we had talked about earlier. And that could have a negative impact on things like food waste and out of shelf products before it gets to the customer. So I think there are a lot of things to consider here. Cost just doesn't mean dollar value.
There's the cost of not using tools that can help you as well. Our last question here, I think this is our last question, is will the rule change buyer requirements? So this is one of these rules that there's this dependency through your supply chain. So you can't comply with the rule if your supply chain partners, especially those who are providing product to you, haven't complied with the rule. So there's this real relationship here, and I think some interesting questions around whether buyers will align around industry standards, whether buyers will say, you figure it out, whether the buyers will have their own unique requirements, whether things just won't change at all. I think the association is part of the Produce Traceability Initiative. It leverages the GS1 128 system of standards. It is a barcode, and yeah, scanning every barcode may not be the easiest when we think about the volume that's going in and out of some of these points in the supply chain. There are newer technologies that can fit the bill. And so I'll be curious as time goes on to see how they may be adopted or adapted to meet these requirements and meet the needs of the industry. But let's go ahead and share the poll results. And who would like to comment on what we're seeing here? Another loaded question that I've placed here.
I'm going first. I would say it reflects accurately. I think push might be a strong word, but I think buyers will have requirements for suppliers. It's been the history of anything related to traceability. And really my response to it, a reaction is what I always say is, rather than trying to push a single technology or a single platform, as they're looking for, if they are looking for technology or they're looking to layer things on, just to try to make it compatible, recognizing that there isn't one system necessarily that's going to solve all this, but instead make sure that the systems are compatible with each other. So if we're sending data in one way because it's important for our operation, that it's cognizant of how it's going to be used upstream. And those are the platforms that I think are going to win. And those are the solutions that are going to, from a technology standpoint. And it's a discussion between the supplier and buyers. It's just make sure that we all try to understand what we're trying to achieve. And I think then it's not so much a push requirements, but it's like just sharing expectations and this is how it's going to work and looking for different options.
Just prior to joining this webinar, I got to listen in on a think tank that IFPA hosted on this topic of traceability, and specifically with buyers. And there was definitely recognition that this is an area where everybody does need to work together to make this just manageable. Tejas, anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, looking back, I'm sure people are waiting for Walmart to say something here. Because of our size and scale, I think we have a disproportional impact on this question in some ways. But if you look at the history of where we've hopefully used our scale for good, we were one of the early adopters of GFSI to drive alignment and standardization across that certification space. We were one of the early adopters and one of the few retailers that require PTI labels on our produce items. And so to the extent that we can, Walmart wants to align with industry standards or maybe even develop industry standards jointly with the industry. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be better for everyone. I think there's good news and bad news here. In 2018, when we launched our Food Traceability Initiative, we were doing it on a voluntary basis. It was not a regulatory requirement. Walmart and our supplier partners were probably impacted by that more so than other supply chains and other retailers. The good news here is that all retailers are equally impacted, and all the suppliers that supply FTL foods are equally impacted. And so there is incentive here to actually work together, then use this as a strategic advantage.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were waiting for the rule and were reluctant to make moves before the rule was final because they didn't know what they were going to need to comply with. But the rule does, and I think the reason that you have regulations is to level set so that it does put people in the same boat. Real quick, PTI had laid out many milestones. The first several were adoption this is a voluntary standard. And as Tejas mentioned, it hasn't seen, I don't think it's achieved the full benefit yet, largely because it was voluntary. Now that we have a rule and it's not voluntary anymore, I think that we'll see some more progress. And so there is a standardized label that many retailers, many buyers have signed on to on that bottom, because even though the data elements were specified for PTI using the GS1128 barcode, the bells and whistles of what size do you want your font? There was some variation there that made it difficult for suppliers to manage all the different buyer requirements. So there is some harmonization now, I'm glad to report, in that area. That's it, I think, for our prepared remarks. They were off the cuff prepared remarks, but I'll stop screen sharing.
As we approach the end, farewell. Summary, takeaway, your final thoughts and words from today. I'll let each of you go.
This is something that I have been working on for the past 15 years. And in some ways, it is amazing to see how through the same types of questions and concerns and issues that are being raised. But on the other hand, we do see progress in terms of, if only just more people having conversations and realizing that we're in the same boat, we need to solve this together. Technology has improved, costs have come down, so we can do things today that we couldn't do 15 years ago from a technology standpoint. But about 10 years ago, we asked some experts, where do you see traceability in 10 years? And I don't know that we have achieved the vision that many of the experts were hoping for. But with this rule, now establishing a foundation that we can all work off of, I am optimistic. It's not going to be easy, but hopefully the benefit is worth it.
One comment I said, overall, they got it right. It's not overly prescriptive and it sticks to the key data elements that I think are important and critical. I think the good thing when we put the slide up of what problem are they trying to solve, and we talked about what traceability means. The one positive thing I believe that comes out of this is information should come in faster. And when we talked about the shelf life of produce and we talked about, I think that's going to be helpful, but that's also the downside is information is going to come in faster and it's going to be a lot of information. And so they're just going to get the same information that ultimately they get now. It typically takes longer. And I think that is going to be the challenge. It's still the challenge of what and how we're going to use that information. And I would just encourage that, again, that iterative process where now that you're getting the information faster, we can go through the maybe earlier in the hypothesis generating aspect. Does it match the distribution? Does it match this? Or is it just the large companies are showing up a lot? That might not be as important. So I think really re-examining the whole investigation process is going to be important here. And I think I'm with Jennifer. I'm optimistic that's going to be important because we maybe not be talking about traceability as the problem anymore.
I'll be really quick, Laura. 3 years is not a long time. I would encourage you to start today. Start figuring out everything that Jennifer and Drew said. It's going to come upon us sooner than we think.
Thank you all. Fantastic and engaging presentation and discussion. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. I hope you can join us on March 16th for Foodborne Illness Attribution. I think we'll learn a lot. Please watch for my messages regarding this webinar recording, our key takeaway summary, which will be high-level overview, and also registration for that next webinar with Dr. Scharf. I want to thank all my panelists again. Really appreciated it. Brilliant minds, really good comments. And again, have a wonderful rest of your evening or wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.